How many of you were here for at least one of? Okay. So I had a really great introduction, but then Zach took it. And as I was rewriting it in my mind, Sharon took it. So I'm honored to introduce Rabbi Kanarek as we were classmates together. So in fact, Jane and I met on the very first day of graduate school a few years ago. I want to introduce Jane through her teaching. So over the course of last night and today, you've gotten a sense of her erudition, her knowledge of tradition, and her wonderful pedagogical style. And these are all things that actually make their way into some of her public writing. And for years, I've been teaching at a Jewish high school at night on Tuesday nights at Chizuk Emunah. So I'm not a trained high school teacher. I'm an academic. So I get rambunctious high school students at like 6 o'clock at night, 7 o'clock at night, and I'm told, teach them about Jewish views of justice. And so I'm trying. Last year, I realized that Jane wrote an essay that can open their minds in a way that allows them to read with me and understand Jewish views of justice in a really practical way. And so I just really wanted to share a few snippets of an essay that Jane wrote. I'm sorry that I'm bringing up an essay that you wrote a very long time ago, but it's one of those texts that will remain relevant 40, 50, 100 years from now. What does tikkun olam actually mean? That's the title of the essay. We hear this term often, and it's become sort of a cliche, right? It's connected to social justice, but it has become somewhat divorced from its mystical roots. And then you'd say, well, it's not mystical. It goes all the way back to the Mishnah. How do you know? Because Rabbi Kanarek taught us this. And in the essay, she takes us through its origins and the many different uses of the term. And one of the things that you learn is an authentic Jewish tradition. It is in the past, but it's also in the present. It's not that because we have so many different views of tradition that somehow we're relativistic, right? That Judaism can mean anything. It's just a snapshot of the present moment. What is rooted in this moment and what we're grounded in that's Jewish is what's relevant. It doesn't mean that all things are true equally. And so I want to share with you these paragraphs in which she describes the difference between chesed and tikkun olam and gives us a sense of what a Jewish view of justice really is. Not really is, but what it is in this moment. She writes, acts of chesed are responses from one individual to another in a difficult or desperate time. A response to help that person get through the day. The person performing the act of chesed does not ask why a person has that need or attempt to plan for the future. So you can think in your day-to-day life the many acts of chesed that you perform. Tikkun olam is not to respond to one person, but to a perception of an overarching injustice. A sense that existing law must be modified to create a more balanced or equitable society. I added equitable. You've been doing that with your texts. I will do that with you. I'm honored. You are now a sacred text. Chesed is our reminder that as we ask why people suffer from hunger, we also remember to bring meals to the hungry and contribute to organizations to provide food for the poor. It's actually harder to help people in need than it is to somehow figure out how to help them, which is a paradox. Chesed reminds us not to forget the people that make up our societies. Tikkun olam teaches us to try to change society itself. And I have to say that this has resonated with 16, 17, and 18-year-olds every single time I teach it. And so I'm grateful that you made my life a little bit easier, at least one day out of the many. So Rabbi Kanarek, thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's really gratifying to know when something that I write actually has an afterlife and can even be interpreted and be helpful with teenagers too. So thank you. And I also just want to say, I know that being here this weekend is both a celebration and also a time of sorrow. And I'm very grateful for the way in which you have welcomed me into this community and held both the sorrow and the celebration. And I want to just name that I think it's very rare that a community can do that and has the clergy that can also walk with them through both of those moments. And so I'm grateful for that. And I'm also, in the time that I've been here, had a sense that this is a community that does both chesed and tikkun olam. And that's rare and special and really a gift. So thank you as well for welcoming me at this time, both of celebration and sorrow for the community. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. When I was in college, I started to return in a more formal way to Jewish religious practice. I had since I'd been a child, really interested in Jewish history. I was so nerdy at public school, 5th grade. My 5th grade teacher said, Jane, I want you to do a special project. What topic would you like to do a special research project on? And the project I chose to do was on the Nuremberg trials. This is for real. So I presented on the Nuremberg trials with pictures of all the Nazi war criminals that were on trial to my 5th grade public school class, and that's what I did. So I really retained this kind of real interest in Jewish history, not just the Nuremberg trials, but Jewish history in general. But I'd said, this is my older words now, I want nothing to do with the religion, and I created this dichotomy between the religion and the history. I can be part of the history, but want nothing to do with the religion. And slowly, towards the end of high school, things started to shift, and I started to come back to actually being interested not only in history, but also in in a life also connected with Jewish religious practice as well. I mean, I still had to go to Shabbat dinners at my house and all of that. It's not that I wasn't doing anything, but I proclaimed not interested. So I think this was either my freshman or my sophomore year of college. I decided, I want to come back to the Torah. And what I decided I had to find in the Torah was that story of Avraham becoming a monotheist, deciding he believed in God, and going to break all of the idols in his father's store. I'd learned it in Hebrew school. I'd read it multiple times. He goes and he breaks the idols, and he puts a stick in one of the idol's hand, and his father comes in and says, Avraham, didn't you do this? And he said, what do you mean I didn't do it? You believe they're alive. It couldn't have been that. So I read the book of Genesis 5 times, really, in English, to try and find this story of Abraham breaking the idols. Now, you should all be looking at me and saying, but it's not there, Jane. It is not there. I will confirm it is not in the book of Genesis and Sefer Bereshit. So I finally realized it wasn't there, and it must have been in that little book of Midrash that I got as a present from Hebrew school, which was still on my bookshelf, and indeed the story was there. So why am I telling you this story? Whatever happened to me in Hebrew school, that story of Avraham breaking the idols had become part of Sefer Bereshit for me. It had become part of the book of Genesis. That was how I understood the book. It had to be in there as a story, and it was how Avraham became a monotheist and how the Jewish people started. It had become Sefer Bereshit. What we are going to be doing together today is looking at the book of Genesis, at Sefer Bereshit, not for the Avraham story of breaking the idols, but we're going to be looking at how Sefer Bereshit, how the book of Genesis actually becomes a source for halakha, for rabbinic law, and looking at that as part of the process of the Bible, I'm going to say the Hebrew Bible intentionally, becoming a rabbinic document and a source for what it means to actually live as a Jew. So that's the project. It's going to be a chance to learn together about how the Bible becomes rabbinic. One thing I'd like to say to my rabbinical students is that Jews are more like Catholics than Protestants. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm really oversimplifying both Protestantism, Catholicism, and Judaism right now, so I ask for forgiveness ahead of time. But part of Protestant ideology is that I can read the Bible as myself, on my own, and know what it means, in a sense, to live as a good Protestant. Catholics don't say that. They go through canon law. They go through the church as the authoritative interpretation of the Bible. Jews are actually more like Catholics. I can't actually sit down and read the Torah and know what it means to live as a Jew. I might know, okay, remember Shabbat, guard it, but I don't actually know, to echo you last night, that I'm supposed to remember it with specific words of Kiddush, and I certainly don't know that those words are supposed to be recited over wine. All of that happens later on. That's what we're going to be digging into, is, first of all, how do we learn to read the Torah through the eyes of the rabbis? More specifically, Sefer Bereshit, the book of Genesis, as a key to reading the Torah. And along the way, we're also going to be thinking about the project of law as a project of meaning-making. That's what we're going to be doing today. So how are we going to do that? We're going to be looking at a few narratives from Sefer Bereshit that become sources for law. We're going to be looking at the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. We're going to be looking at Rebekah's match with Isaac, so actually today's Parsha, it's kind of fitting. And we're going to be looking at the stories of Joseph's brothers going down to Egypt. We're not going to be reading any of these stories in full, just kind of recapping them, and then focus on a few different laws that the ancient rabbis derived from these sources. So that's the overview. Why Sefer Bereshit? Not just because it gave me a chance to tell you about me in college and reading it 5 times looking for a story that wasn't there. The reason we're going to be looking at Sefer Bereshit is because of all of the different sections of the Torah, it is the section that is least, that one might conceptualize as the least likely to be a source for law. Why? Because of all of the books of the Torah, all of the 5 books, it is the most narrative of all the books of the Torah. In other words, it contains the fewest places that we might actually say, oh, this is a law. It certainly doesn't have long law codes like Shmot does, like Vayikra does, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, even the book of Numbers. Rather, we might conceptualize Sefer Bereshit as the origin story of the people Israel before they become a nation. So it's a story of the birth of humanity, the creation of the earth, animals, families, individuals, children being born. It's really the story of the individuals who eventually birth the nation Israel, which really happens in the book of Shmot. It's a narrative. It's stories. That's what Sefer Bereshit is. But there's also another part that is interesting to me for my purposes with Sefer Bereshit. Now I'm going to do a little bit of overview of rabbinic midrash, so rabbinic interpretation of scripture. So I'm going to ask you to just stay with me for a moment for a little bit about genre here. We generally divide the corpus of classical midrash into 2 chronological stages. By classical midrash, I mean the midrash that is compiled somewhere from the 3rd century of the Common Era to around the 5th century of the Common Era. So we generally divide it into 2 different corpuses, Tannaitic Midrash and Amoraic Midrash. Tannaitic Midrash refers to the collections that were compiled sometime in the 3rd century by the rabbis we call the Tannaim, so sometime around the 3rd century. Amoraic Midrash refers to the corpus of midrashim that were compiled sometime around the 5th century of the Common Era. So that's number 1. We have earlier and later, Tannaitic and Amoraic. This is where it gets a little bit more complicated next. Tannaitic Midrash, the earlier Midrash, is also often referred to as halachic Midrash or legal Midrash. and it focuses on the legal sections of the Torah. So we have Tannaitic Midrash on the book of Exodus, actually starting from chapter 12, which is the first communal law given in the Torah. This month to you shall be the new month. So we have it on the book of Exodus, on the book of Leviticus, on the book of Numbers, and on the book of Deuteronomy. What book don't we have legal midrash on? Genesis. We're missing on Bereshit. We do not have an extant corpus of legal midrash on the book of Genesis on Sefer Bereshit. Amoraic midrash, on the other hand, is also referred to as Agadic midrash because it refers to the Agadic, i.e. narrative, because it focuses, on Agadic, i.e. narrative, the story sections of the Torah. So these genres are both these collections are both chronological and genre. Tannaitic Midrash focuses on legal corpus, and Amoraic focuses on the story parts, the narrative. We have Amoraic Midrash on the book of Genesis, on the book of Leviticus. Actually, we have it on the cycles of the holidays, and part of it is part of this genre known as Bereshit Rabbah, Midrash Rabbah, the Great Midrash. But we do have Amoraic Midrash. We have it also on Deuteronomy and on Numbers. But we have, most importantly, we do have Amoraic Midrash, a whole book on Sefer Bereshit. Why do I care about this here? Actually, let me step back. So what I want you to notice for the moment is that when we're in Tannaitic Midrash, there is no formal thing that we would call a book today on the book of Bereshit, on Sefer Bereshit. When we get to Amoraic Midrash, a little bit later, in the 5th century, all of a sudden, we have an incredible corpus of interpretation, an interpretive literature on the book of Genesis. This is doubly interesting to me because when we step back even further into the Second Temple period, so the time when the Second Temple in Jerusalem was standing before it was destroyed in 70 of the Common Era, so this is the predecessor to what I'm calling the Tannaitic period. The Second Temple literature has a rich interpretive tradition on the book of Genesis. One of the most prominent of those is the book of Jubilees, which was written in the 2nd century before the Common Era. And Jubilees retells the Genesis narratives and weaves law into its retelling of these narratives. So it transforms Sefer Bereshit into these etiological stories, so origin stories of particular laws, that either anticipate later halakha, later what we call Mosaic law, or justify the actions of a biblical character that appear to violate what we call post-Sinaitic law. So for example, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, becomes an origin story for the Passover festival. The 7-day journey, 3 days to the mountain, 1 day at the mountain, 3 days back, paralleling the 7 days of Pesach itself. So something happens, I have no idea what, to be honest with you, in the Tannaitic period, where the book of Genesis almost disappears. It is no longer a source for interpretation. Somehow in the Amoraic period, the book of Genesis, Sefer Bereshit, reemerges as a crucial book of the Bible, of the Torah, ready for interpretation in its own right. Part of what I want to do with you tonight is look at some of the places where Sefer Bereshit reemerges as a place for interpretation of law. And what we're going to be doing together is looking at how turning Sefer Bereshit into a legal text is part of what makes the Bible rabbinic, and part of what will enable us to carry Sefer Bereshit with us when we ourselves engage in halakha. So I've been very, very frontal for a little while now with talking to you about it. And so with one more thing to say, we're going to turn to the text itself. When these stories become law, what we're also going to see is that the stories themselves don't disappear, but they become law in such a way that law also carries these stories with it. So I'm not sure now, if I went back to my college self, if I'd go looking through the Torah and reading it again and again, looking for these texts, but that's the spirit with which I want us to read them. So we're going to turn to the Talmud. You have your source sheet. And the first passage we're going to look at is from the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Chulin. Tractate Chulin is actually all about kosher slaughter. Basically, kosher animals, what makes an animal kosher, and kosher slaughter. Before we dive in though, a little review of the Akedah. I can ask all of you, what happens in the Akedah? Someone start us off with the story. What happens in the binding of Isaac? Not a trick question. I'm just tired of talking.
God calls down to Abraham. Abraham says, here I am. And God says, sacrifice your most favored son to me.
Great. And what does Abraham do?
Sure enough, let's do it.
Great. Abraham walks the mountain, and what happens at Har Moriah, at the place? What happens at this place?
He ties Isaac up, sets him down, gets the knife out, and the angel stops him.
Excellent. Great. Great. And then they come down off the mountain. So that's our summary of the Akedah. One might want to call it a text of terror of Abraham taking his son to this mountain to slaughter him, and it looks like he's ready to do it. So with that background, let's look at this first text from the Babylonian Talmud. I want to warn you, if you were at my previous sessions, in some ways I think these passages are less accessible, a little bit more complicated. No, it's totally possible, trust me. Totally possible. But we are going to make them make sense together, I promise you. But this is just the Talmud. Sometimes does this. Okay. I'm going to read it, and then we're going to unpack it together. Sat Rav behind Rabbi Chia, and Rabbi Chia sat before Rabbi. I'm going to read it through and then go back and unpack it. And sat Rabbi and said, what is the biblical source that ritual slaughter must be performed with a detached object? As it is written, and Abraham sent out his hand, and he took the knife to slaughter his son. Said Rav to Rabbi Chia, what did he say? He said to him, he said the letter Vav written on a tree trunk. But he said a verse. The verse teaches us about the zealousness of Abraham. This is more obscure than our other texts, correct? Okay, excellent. So let's make it a little less obscure for the moment. We know that the ancient rabbis learned in disciple circles, that they sat together. They didn't sit in yeshivot in rows, as we often have this image. They learned in small circles, in homes, alleyways, courtyards. The first image we have from this text is an image then of a disciple circle. So you have, these are early Amoraic sages, or these are all sages on the boundary from the Tannaitic to the Amoraic period, by which I mean you can imagine them around the year 200 of the Common Era, and they're all sitting together. So Rav is sitting behind Rabbi Chia, and Rabbi Chia is sitting before Rabbi, and Rabbi here is Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who is the editor, the compiler of the Mishnah. That's who they are. So the three of them are sitting together. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi is the one with the highest status in this group. So Rabbi sits, they're all sitting, and he says, what to these other two, what is the source from the Torah that ritual slaughter, in other words, the way in which we kill an animal to make it fitting to eat, kosher slaughter, I want to know the biblical proof text that when we are slaughtering an animal for food, that the object that you use to slaughter the animal has to be detached. What do I mean by that? We'll see later. It means that it can't be stuck in the ground. How one would do that, I don't know. A tall reed, we'll imagine that a little bit later. But anyway, sounds a little obscure, but he wants to know, how do we know that it's an object that you have to hold in your hand? Stick with me. Not clear who the answer is. He might himself be answering. It seems like Rabbi's asking a rhetorical question. And what does he answer? As it is written, and Abraham sent out his hand, and he took the knife to slaughter his son. Vayikach et ha'ma'achelet lishchot. What is the answer is the source? It's a verse from the story of the Akedah. The scene when Abraham sent out his hand, took the knife to kill his son. That, according to Rabbi, is the source for how we do ritual slaughter of an animal and the type of implement that must be used. Then said Rav to Rabbi Chia, you can almost imagine these two sages having a conversation behind Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's back. What the hell did he say? What is that man talking about? And then Rabbi Chia whispers to Rav, he said the letter Vav written on a tree trunk. What does that mean? This is the only place in the entire Talmud that that phrase appears, the letter Vav written on a tree trunk. Basically, Rabbi Chia says back to Rav, he said nonsense. Don't listen to that man. That's what the letter Vav written on a tree trunk means. Following Rashi's interpretation, he said nothing. And then Rav says back, but wait a minute, he said a verse. He quoted the Torah. How can he be wrong? What are you talking about? And then Rabbi Chia says, yeah, he said a verse. But that verse about Abraham sending out his hand and taking the knife to slaughter his son doesn't teach us anything about how we're actually supposed to do kosher slaughter. What it teaches us about is the zealousness of Abraham, his zealousness to carry out God's word. So we have two different things, opinions about what it might teach. One is that it teaches a law about ritual slaughter, and the other is that it teaches us a behavioral paradigm about how we were supposed to carry out legal commandments, mitzvot, and we're supposed to carry them out in a zealous manner, not to hesitate, but to rush to do it. That's the conversation between these disciples. So I'm going to pause for a moment here and ask you, either, you can comment on either one of these. What do you think about this? Or what questions do you have here about this text? What's your reaction to this text, to this passage? I know mine the first time I read it, but...
What does the letter Vav on a tree trunk have to do with anything?
What does it have to do with anything? Why that? Why talk about writing a Vav on a tree trunk? Great.
I have two questions this brought to me. One is the interpretation, I think you said Rashi had, that the letter Vav on a tree trunk meant nonsense. Are there any other rabbis who disagree and say, some I know in maybe Kabbalah, there's some meanings of different letters, etc. And then my other question is, you said your interpretation of the statement, the verse teaches us about the zealousness of Abraham is that that's how we should react, or how we should interpret. But to me, zealous has a bit of a negative connotation and may, in fact, be saying maybe Abraham was a bit too zealous. And thinking myself how willing he was to sacrifice his son, it does seem a bit too zealous.
Great. So I'll say with the first one, there aren't actually that many comments on it. One sees it as if you write a Vav on a tree trunk, it's like a broken letter. So that indicates the nonsense. But I never went further to see if there was anything, kind of a really late commentary that would have come from the Kabbalah to it. What you are doing in your other comment is also looking at the zealousness and saying, this seems to be complementing it, but on the other hand, this is from the story of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, so maybe it's not so great after all.
How often did rabbis challenge their teachers like this, especially with, I think it's a different way, but really saying this person is full of garbage.
Right. I have not done a count to see how often students challenge, and actually that would be in that drastic way.
Around here from time.
Yeah.
Never.
And I would love to actually know that. We had a little bit of a sense of that in one of the texts this last night, where one rabbi says to another, by the crown of the king, you're completely wrong in saying that she's betrothed. But it would be amazing to actually count it up and see how much they say to a student says to a teacher, you're full of it, basically. I would love to know that statistic. Both one,
I was
yeah.
gonna say that it reads to me like a comedy, they don't get anywhere, you know, they're completely off track by the end, you know?
Great, so one way one might also think of this as a comedy, and I did that a little bit intentionally. This is also really characteristic of the Talmud, that it sometimes actually doesn't decide, more often than not, it actually doesn't decide who's right and who's not right. And I also very much like bringing that in, of that kind of sense of, almost, yeah, comedy or
Well, like
laughter.
the men of Helm, like what was the question?
I'm not sure that it's quite Helm. I'll come to that as well, though I love Helm. I love Helm.
Well, just from the context, the way you set things up from the beginning, the historical context of, we're sort of on the cusp where we have one, an older, earlier, whatever view of that really ignores Bereshit, versus the other view where it says that, well, you can actually find something
Yeah,
and it's giving us that tension.
it's giving us that very much, yes.
I think what's interesting is that the rabbi makes this connection between a very mundane act of sacrificing an animal for food and the existential act of binding Isaac and perhaps killing him
It's,
as an allegiance to God. And
Right.
it's not in the discussion, but it's because the discussion exists, it includes them in parallel to one another.
yeah, very much. It's really, really interesting that this text is connecting the slaughter of an animal with this foundational story about a father being willing to kill his son. We're going to push that in a moment.
The original question is about the nature of the tool, the object itself. And the answer is that secondary to the tool is the hand that wields it, and secondary to the hand that wields it is the intention of the person to whom the hand belongs.
Yeah. And so if we take that, the intention of Abraham, and put that back into slaughter of an animal, where does that take you? I'm just curious. It's a wonderful comment of what you're drawing out here about intention and the links between the different chain in the story.
So what came to me before you said that was the intention of slaughtering an animal, the respect that you need to give to that animal, and the honor that you need for that sacrifice for the purpose afterwards, to eat, to survive, and the same sacrifice, to give the same intention as you would for sacrificing Isaac.
So it turns actually the slaughter of an animal for food, brings it away in that reading from something mundane to something which takes much more attention and care, and one might not even take for granted, could even be conceived of as tragic.
You need to offer some more reverence to
Yeah,
it
to it.
than the mundaneness that we normally attribute to it.
And I think along those lines, it seems that the practice was well entrenched, and now we're sort of retrospectively trying to justify it with the intentionality of
The practice of using a detached thing, and now they're linking it with a verse.
It seems both brilliant and slightly chutzpahdik of the rabbis to be able to say we're deriving Jewish law from an episode that didn't actually happen. He didn't actually sacrifice his son, so this could be seen as a terrible proof text, but interesting that they are willing to ignore that piece and still use it anyway.
Right, they're very much willing to ignore that it never finished, because it still becomes a model of, he reached out his hand and he took the knife, they're assuming the knife wasn't attached to the ground. We're going to read one more version of this, so there'll be a chance to give more comments on this. Actually I won't say this yet, so we're going to read now a parallel version of this from the Amoraic Midrash called Genesis Rabbah. So take it as around the same time. It's slightly different, and we'll unpack it again. And Avraham sent out his hand and took the knife. Commentary on that verse. Rav asked before Rabbi Chia Rabbah, it's the same guy, in the name of Rabbi. So same disciple circles, they're sitting around. From where is it derived that ritual slaughter must be performed with a movable object? From here, Rabbi answers, and Avraham sent out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. And now we have an anonymous voice coming in and saying, well, if Rabbi said it to you from Agadah, then he retracted. I'm going to describe what that is in a moment. But if he said it to you from authoritative legal tradition, then he did not retract. So if Rabbi said this to you from a genre just of story, he made it up, he created a nice story, then eventually he went back and said, no. The Akedah is not the source for the fact that ritual slaughter has to be done with a movable object. But if he said it to you because he got it as a legal tradition from his teachers, then he didn't retract, he kept it. As Levi, another sage, taught in a Breita, an earlier tradition, if they were fixed in the ground, so objects, reeds, knives, if they were fixed in the ground from the outset, they're invalid for slaughter. If they were once detached and then fixed in the ground, they are valid for slaughter. So this text seems to prove it's an authoritative legal tradition because we know if something was just always fixed in the ground, I'm imagining a tall reed, they somehow wave it to kind of get the animal, it's not valid. But if it was removed from the ground and then later put in, it's okay. As we teach, one who slaughters with a handsaw, a rock, or a reed, his slaughter is valid. The bottom line of this text, though, is that it's an authoritative legal tradition, and it seems to be saying that this is in fact the proof text. Avraham sent out his hand, he sent out his hand, and he took the knife to slaughter his son. Now I can get some other hands here. There was a hand, yes, no, want to comment? No. One more.
If I remember the story correctly, it ended with the slaughter of an animal, is that right?
Yes.
So I always think of this story as representing a switch from human sacrifice, which probably occurred to many people, to animal sacrifice, which it bothers some of us, but it's probably a step up from human sacrifice. So I see this as much larger.
Yes,
I think they are related.
absolutely. What's really interesting here, though, is that they don't choose the verse about the slaughter of the ram. This text chooses the verse about the slaughter of the person. Could be for two reasons. It uses the verb lishchot, which is the same verb for shchita, ritual slaughter of an animal, and because it has a knife, ma'achelet, but they could have gone to the animal, they go to the person instead. Before we move to the next thing, I want to say a few more things about this. When I first read this text, I was actually pretty shocked that they were going to the Akedah, a story that I consider to be a text of terror, and saying, let's use a verse from here as a source for how we kill an animal for kosher food. Of all the texts in the Torah, I was also fascinated by the fact that it was this verse from Sefer Bereshit that I would never have picked as a source for the knife we need to use for ritual slaughter. I was also fascinated by the debate about, oh, did Rabbi just make this up out of his own head? Or did he actually get this as a tradition from his teachers? When I was studying at Hebrew University in the Talmud department, when I was doing my doctorate, and I was trying to figure out what I was writing my dissertation on, I went to one of my Talmud professors who knew really the entire Talmud almost by heart, Yaakov Zussman, and I said, I found this passage, this one here from Bavli Chulin. I'm really interested in it because it talks about the Akedah as a source for laws about shchita, ritual slaughter. And my professor said to me, what are you talking about? And asked me to give him the example. And I showed him, and he said, oh, this is so interesting. What was interesting to me about this was that my professor had blocked out this sugya. He didn't want to know about it. He'd forgotten it. He was a master of the Talmud. And so I kind of kept asking around, and I found all of these greats, these phenomenal scholars of the Talmud, who just had forgotten about this passage. They'd absolutely forgotten about it. I hypothesized in some ways because it was too shocking and terrifying, they'd actually forgotten about it. What happened when I kept looking a little more? Well, I actually found out that in a 13th century, I went to look at earlier medieval law codes, and right in there was this verse and this passage from the Gemara as a source for how we do ritual slaughter. What else did I learn? There's a whole, in 1096, there were the Crusades, whole Jewish communities wiped out, and we have from that these Crusade chronicles, which were records of the slaughter. And lo and behold, what we actually have there is some examples, this is pretty horrifying, of parents reciting the blessing over kosher slaughter of an animal before killing their children. And saying, I am going to do what Avraham did, or almost did, to his son. So this text was actually a very, very live text in Jewish culture in the ancient period through the medieval period. At some point, we forgot about it. At some point, we forgot about Sefer Bereshit becoming a source for law. Turn the page to page 2. We're going to switch to a not terrifying text. This is from today's Parsha, Genesis 24. I just have an outtake. The whole scene is the scene of Eliezer, as he's called in rabbinic tradition, Abraham's servant, going to find Rebekah. And we're stepping into the story when he's found her and he's negotiated with her family that she's going to come back with him and meet Yitzchak. So we're stepping in the middle, and they ate and drank, he, Eliezer, the servant, and the men who were with him, and they spent the night and rose in the morning. And he said, send me off that I may go to my master. And Rebekah's brother and mother said, let the young woman stay with us 10 days or so, then she may go. And he said to them, do not hold me back. When the Lord has granted success in my journey, send me off that I may go to my master. And they said, let us call the young woman and ask for her answer. And they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? And she said, I will. And they sent off Rebekah, their sister, and her nurse, and Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebekah and said to her, our sister, become hence myriads teeming. May your seed take hold of the gates of its foes. This is one of my favorite stories in the Torah. This is actually my favorite parsha in the whole Torah, Chaye Sarah. I absolutely love this story, and I'm using the word story intentionally. There are no laws in this section. We have a story of eating and drinking. We have a servant wanting to leave. Rebekah's family saying, let her stay with us a little bit longer. The servant saying, no, let me go. And then them saying quite remarkably, well, let us actually ask her if she wants to go or not. And they call Rebekah and say to her, will you go with this man? And she says, Elech, I will go with this man. So they send off Rebekah, their sister, with her nurse, and Abraham's servant and his men, and then they bless Rebekah and they say, our sister, become hence myriads teeming. May your seed take hold of the gates of its foes. It's a beautiful story. Let's go into Genesis Rabbah, the Midrash, once again, and see what they do with this story. They start with the verse, said her brother and mother, let the maiden remain. And then it asks the question, and Bituel, where was he? So who is Bituel? The father, exactly. So I'm going to back up a little. I should have done this. 24, verse 50 and 51. This is not on the sheet, but just listen to me for a second. Then Lavan and Bituel answered, the matter was decreed by God. We cannot speak to you bad or good. Here is Rebekah before you. Take her and go, and let her be a wife to your master's son, as God has spoken. So what happens? Who is missing from verse 55? And her brother and her mother said, let the young woman stay with us 10 days or so, then she may go. Who's missing? Great. Her father's missing. So listen to what the Midrash says. And Bituel, where was he? He wanted to delay, and he was stricken during the night. So in other words, he wanted to delay the marriage. And what happened? He died that night. This is the righteousness of the unblemished straightens his way. So now the Midrash goes on to quote Proverbs. As I said earlier, something that happens often in Midrash is that verses from Proverbs or the book of Psalms, while in their context are not at all references to biblical events or historical events, they become read in Midrash as references to historical events or other events in the Torah. So this verse from Proverbs becomes the righteousness of the unblemished. This is Isaac. Straightens his way, the way of Eliezer. So what does the righteousness of Isaac do? It enables Eliezer to go on this journey with Rivkah back to Isaac. And the end of the verse of Proverbs 11:5 is, and through his evil, the evil man falls. This is Bethuel who wanted to delay and was stricken. So here we have a scene of a father who dies because he wants to prevent the marriage. The next step is really important, though, for what I want to point out to you about law. Next, the Midrash turns to the verse, let the maiden remain with us for days. We need to do a little Hebrew here. Teshev ha'na'ara itanu yamim. Let the maiden remain with us for days. These are the 7 days of his mourning. Days become 7 days, and it becomes a reference to the laws of mourning. In order for this Midrash to make this move, it has had to kill off Bethuel. Right? It's killed him off. And now it's able to say, oh, why is Rebecca staying there a little longer? She needs to sit Shiva for her father. So she's also become a pious Jew in the process. In the Hebrew it says, let the maiden remain with us, yamim o asor, which literally translates as days or 10. But they make 10, actually they widen it, and make it refer to yet another legal context. I'll explain to you, or 10. These are the 12 months that we give to a virgin to furnish herself. Let me translate. Rabbinic marriage has 2 stages, betrothal and marriage, kiddushin and nisuin. In our contemporary marriage ceremonies, kiddushin is the ring, and nisuin is marked by the Sheva brachot, but it's really the standing under the chuppah, the wearing the veil. Those are the 2 stages. We are often told that in the ancient world, there used to be 12 months a year between those 2 stages. So you should get betrothed, acquired with kesef, with money perhaps, and then a year later she'd get married. Actually, that time period was quite flexible. It could be a month, it could be multiple years. So here what this is saying is that time period, let the maiden remain with us for days or 10, refers to a combination of the laws of mourning of Shiva, or this law that a woman needs 12 months in between betrothal and actually fully marrying her husband to prepare herself. Next stage, they said, let us call the maiden, etc. When they're asking her, do you want to go? From here, we derive that we only marry an orphan with her consent. So a girl whose father has died can only be married with her consent. According to this text, the source for that is this story about Rebecca's marriage. And then they called to Rebecca and they said to her, Rabbi Hanina, the son of Rabbi Ada, in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, they were hinting to her, will you go? And she said, I will go. I am going against your will and not with your good wishes. So what does the story of Rebecca become? It becomes a story about 3 different laws. It becomes a story about the laws of mourning, that Rebecca stays with her family to mourn her father. It becomes a story about how marriage actually happens. It becomes a story about the need for an orphan to consent to her marriage. And it also becomes a story about Rebecca's will. She becomes a strong-willed woman who says, I know it very well that you don't actually want me to go, You've tried to delay me in every way possible. I'm going to go against your will and not with your good wishes. Rebecca's story of her betrothal becomes a story of how one walks within rabbinic law. Turn it over. Okay. I promised a little bit in the video that I made that I would talk about minyan and the source for minyan and how we know that a minyan is made up of 10 people. I'm going to use people in this context intentionally. We're going to start from a passage called the Tanhuma. It's a little bit later Midrash, a little bit later than Bereshit Rabbah, we'll say. And the verse we're starting with is 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to get grain rations from Egypt. So the story is about Joseph's brothers and Joseph's brothers journeying down to Egypt, the 10 of them. And this Midrash asks, and why 10? Why did 10 brothers go down? Because 10 has the power to ward off sufferings. For when the Holy Blessed One came to destroy Sodom, and Abraham our father requested mercy for them from heaven, he began to count from 50 to 10. As it is said, what if 10 will be found there? Because 10 are an assembly, an Eidah. An Eidah is what we need for a minyan. As it is said, for how long will this wicked assembly keep muttering against me? This is from the narrative of the spies. We're going to circle back to that. As it is written, God stands in the divine assembly. God stands, Elohim nitzav ba'adat el. Therefore it is said, and 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to Egypt. For in Sodom, he said, until 10. Abraham said, until 10. So, let me unpack this a little bit. Why do we need 10? 10 people for a minyan, first of all, have the power to ward off sufferings. How do we know? Because Abraham counted down from 50 to 10 when he was pleading for mercy in Sodom. What else do we know? 10 are an assembly, 10 are an Eidah. And how do I know this? We're going to fill this in a little more. Because from the spies' narrative, how long will this assembly, this Eidah, keep muttering against me? And if you remember in the spies' narrative, they start with 12. 2 of them bring back a good report, Kalev and Yehoshua. And there are 10 that bring back a bad one. And then we have a final verse, God stands in the divine assembly. Therefore it is said, and 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to Egypt. Why? Because they could ward off suffering. If you want to stick with me for a few more technical minutes, turn over to the last page. We're going to come back in a moment. My last little bit of Bereshit. I will fully confess that I put this in the back because I wasn't sure if I was going to do it with you, because it's quite technical, but I'm just going to take a risk and do it with you anyway and ask you to stick with me, because by now we're number 3, so hopefully you'll trust me that it will make sense. We're going to start at the bottom with the Jerusalem Talmud with Yerushalmi Megillah. And really this, actually I won't say it. Okay, taught Shmuel, the sanctification of the month is only recited with 10. What that means is the special blessing one recites on a new month, it's only recited in a minyan with 10 people. Rabbi Ba, these are Rabbi Abba, Rabbi Yassa, said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. It says here, assembly, and it says further on, how much longer shall that wicked assembly? Translation, that first quote is from the story of Korach and his rebellion against Moshe, his Eidah. And the second verse is from the spies story. So it says here with Korach assembly, it says with the spies, the wicked assembly. Just as assembly said further on with the spies refers to 10, so too here with Korach, when it says Eidah, assembly, it must refer to 10 people. Now we get more obscure. Said Rabbi Shimon, it says here among, and it says further on, and the sons of Israel came to procure rations among those coming. So again, we're with the sons of Jacob who go down to Israel. Just as further on it refers to 10, so here it refers to 10. I'm going to stop there. What I want you to notice in this text is 3 verses. One is the sons of Israel who go down to procure rations. The other is the assembly of Korach, and the other is the spies. These are the 3 tens that, according to the Jerusalem Talmud, are the basis for a minyan having 10 people. Come up for a moment to Bavli Megillah on the top of the page. You'll see the 10 sons, the sons of Jacob, disappear. This is the so-called famous one, as I like to say, famous in certain limited circles, which you are now about to be part of. Bavli Megillah 23b. From where, what is the biblical text from where we derive that these rituals, there's a whole list of rituals which require 10 people. We know some of them. Let's just start with the Kedusha in the Amidah. Said Rabbi Chia, again, the son of Abba, and the name of Rabbi Yochanan, as the Torah says, V'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael, and I will be made holy among the children, the sons of Israel. And the Talmud goes on to say, any matter that is in the category of holiness, davar shebekedusha, may not be with less than 10. And then the Talmud asks from what verses may this be inferred. Rabbi Chia says it's derived from a comparison of the words among and among. It's written here, I will be made holy among the children of Israel. It's written there, stand back from among this assembly, Korach, and it's derived from a comparison of the words assembly, assembly. And it is written there, how much longer shall this wicked assembly? Again, the spies. What I want you to notice here is that we start with a verse about God being made holy among Israel. We move to Korach, and we move to the spies. There's no sons of Israel here. That's in the Yerushalmi's version. It seems to have disappeared from Bavli Megillah. I love these texts about minyan, and I want to bring us back in particular to the sons of Jacob that are found in Yerushalmi Megillah. We normally think of places of holiness as places of perfection, perhaps, or communities that aspire to perfection. But all 3 of these texts, in a sense, are troubling texts. Certainly the Akedah, as a source of law, is a deeply, deeply troubling text. The story of Rebekah is less so, but nevertheless we have woven into it the death of her father, the family that doesn't want to let her go, and her walking away. In these texts about minyan, we have Sodom and Amorah. We have Sodom, the city known for its evil being destroyed. We have the brothers who sold their other brother into slavery. We have the wilderness spies who bring back a bad report about the land. And we have Korach, the rebellion, here. So I'm going to say something about this and then circle back to Bereshit. What these texts about minyan say to me is that a community is not made up of perfect people. In fact, the very basis for community here is imperfection. And when we make an Edah, or a minyan, as it becomes in later Hebrew, we are actually being asked to create a community made up of imperfect people, and to hold what we have done well and what we have also not done well. And it is through holding all of that that we are able to do V'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael, I will be made holy, to make God holy amongst Israel. It's not perfection that makes us holy, it's actually imperfection. And it is not perfection that makes a community holy either, according to these texts. Let me circle back to Sefer Bereshit and law. Sefer Bereshit, I think, becomes a very powerful source for law, precisely because it is filled with so many flawed characters, and precisely because it is such a human story. They are attracted to it because they can delve into the humanity of these characters, and from the humanity of these characters actually create ways for us to walk through life, and ways in which we may also live as Jews. But what does that mean as well? It means that when we engage in ritual slaughter, we are also carrying the story of Abraham with us, and what happened to Abraham and his son. When we get married, we are carrying the story of Rivka with us. When we sit Shiva, we are also carrying her story and the story of Bituel with us. When we make a minyan, we are carrying the story of Joseph's going down into slavery and Joseph's freedom. We are carrying that with us. Making Bereshit into a source for law means that when we live our Jewish lives, we are carrying all of those stories with us, with their wonder and with their flaws. So I'm going to stop here. I'm happy to take questions if there are. That was more technical. Yeah.
So do you then theorize that the Tanaim didn't do that because they were afraid of using these flawed people to derive halacha?
I have to think more about it, but I think there's something happening in the Amorite period where, I'm going to use this word, they need to somehow also domesticate Sefer Bereshit because it has all these stories that could actually wreak a lot of havoc, so to speak. The younger inherits over the older. The father nearly tries to carry his son. The woman goes without her, maybe against her family's will. So I think there's something going on that I'm still trying to work out that is pushing them to do this work with Bereshit, with Sefer Bereshit, that wasn't happening earlier on. And my full confession is I'm not totally sure what that is yet. Yeah.
Or was it that they took practice as it was sort of known through the community and began to codify the uses?
The reason. I tend to think of it as both, that there's some laws that were just some things that were done and were practices, and then they looked for the verse and attached it to it. But I think at other times they're actually really genuinely reading scripture and saying, what does this mean for halakha? And I don't think you can really tease out which one is which, but I think both processes are going on at this period.
You're very interested in intercultural influence from non-Jews on Jews. So I know that some people say that the reason the Talmud was codified when it was because there was pressure. In the water in Persia and elsewhere. You have every people needs to have this codified thing, right?
Yeah.
And so was there something in the water culturally that you need to take your problematic holy texts and use exegesis to get them into the law? Is that a thing, or is this a uniquely Amoraic thing?
Yeah, this is exactly what I'm intrigued by now as I'm kind of returning to look at this, is what else is happening perhaps with Christian readings of Sefer Bereshit at this time that's driving this, because it is different than the Tannaitic period. We do have some peepings out of uses of Bereshit for law, but we don't have any corpus like this.
The church fathers weren't doing this for you.
That's what I'm curious about.
Yeah.
That's what I'm really curious about. Yeah.
You made a very brief reference to the Crusades. Can you expand on the rationale, I'll just call it, of families sacrificing their children? Were they worried about?
Yeah, they were worried about conversion. So we have both a whole record of suicide and some records of parents slaughtering their children before they themselves committed suicide in the Crusade Chronicles. It's incredibly brutal. It's incredibly brutal. I actually have one other interesting passage on here that I didn't do with you that if there's time I can read. But it's this really horrifying chronicle. And part of what was interesting to me when I read it was how much people have hidden themselves from this very live, living way in which the Akedah became a model for piety in these really terrifying circumstances. It's like we erased it from our memory, from our consciousness and our memory, because it was just too terrifying to confront.
Well, how do we know that Rebecca's family was trying to prevent the marriage? How do we know it wasn't a case of Rebecca, if you want to go with Abraham's servant, that's fine with us, we love you, we're gonna miss you, give us a few days to adjust to you not being here. And besides, we need to get somebody to do the work you've been doing, it's
Right.
gonna take us a couple days. How do we know that it was a case of preventing as opposed to delaying?
It could very much be exactly what you said. That's not the way this text is imagining it, but you could write another midrash which would reframe it in that way. So I'm not saying this is actually the way it happened, it's just the way in which Genesis Rabbah, Bereshit Rabbah, is imagining it happened.
I'm just curious, do you think to an extent that by bringing in these very flawed, even wicked people as representatives, there's something in the notion that they're trying to introduce of scale as sort of an antidote, of community as an antidote to our individual wickedness? And
Right.
thinking of American jurisprudence,
Right.
we have this notion, at least, that if you take 12 people, they'll sort of become one rational.
I love that. I haven't actually thought of that before as a reason for doing it. But I think would be really interesting lens to take to this corpus of texts around 10 people. Because nowhere do they really explain in detail why it has to be 10. We see it peeking out in the Dead Sea Scrolls, has an Eidah, musical language of an Eidah. And so we're really guessing at why they hit on this number. So it'd just be a great lens to take.
I love this. The proof text that you use to make the claim that the Bible becomes rabbinic are halachic texts. In other words, that they're using a section of the Torah which seems to be narrative, and they're using it in order to prove certain things about Jewish behavior. But your opening anecdote was not about that. It was actually about your discovering not like why halachically we do anything, but why Abraham had the kind of theological awakening that he did. And I'm wondering if you could say a word about the Bible becoming rabbinic, not in terms of our praxis, but actually in terms of like the story of lived expressions of Judaism in the world, how we think, how we interact with stories.
Right. I could do that as a whole separate lecture, but I will also say a few things now. So I think what I think happens in this process of narrative becoming law, I've done it in a way almost as I spoke about it like they're dichotomous, but I actually don't think that they are for the rabbis, that they're very much interwoven together. So this process of turning narrative into law means that law also takes a narrative form, and in essence, it almost becomes a theology. They wouldn't use the word theology, but to mourn and carry Rebecca's story with you gives it much more of a resonance than it would without it, I happen to think. But I will also say that I do think part of making the Bible rabbinic is also just taking these stories and opening them up, to a much, to another realm, almost kind of like a chain novel of let's build on it, let's build on it, let's build on it. But I think that the genres are very interdependent in their world.
So I'm a bit confused about Rebecca being an orphan.
Yeah.
Her mother was there, her brother was there.
Yeah.
Her father died, but I'm missing that orphan piece.
So in rabbinic law, a child whose father has died but mother is still alive is considered to be an orphan for certain legal purposes, and I should have said that more clearly.
All right, thank you.
I just wanted to follow up, when you were talking about a minion, you said you were using the word people specifically, and that you'd explain that, and I didn't, could you explain that?
Yeah, I just kind of I'll say two things. I kind of wanted to elide the issue, but it is actually really interesting that in these earlier rabbinic texts, They don't actually name 10 males. The first time that happens is in the 16th century Shulchan Aruch, that it actually names that the members of a minyan have to be male. So that's number one. In my translation, I did do the children of Israel / sons of Israel, because you could really use that as evidence they need to be men. But my take on minyan, which I got from one of my teachers, Rabbi Stephen Wald, was basically from the Bavli's version of the proof text. It says, "V'nigdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael," I will be sanctified in the midst of Israel. So a community is a place that can actually do this act of sanctifying God. And the proof texts that follow don't actually emphasize the maleness of these communities at all. So what I like to ask myself is, what does it actually mean to be a community that can make God holy? But I was also eliding it because these texts don't emphasize gender. It might be that they take it for granted, but it's not something they emphasize at all. That happens later on. It happens much later on. Yeah. In the back.
I don't know if I'm being overly simplistic, but there's something that seems odd to me about what is being treated as authoritative and how. So in the first two things that you gave us, it's taking Torah as authoritative, but not in the sense of, what it seems to be is not in the sense of trying to interpret the story. What does the story that we're reading in the Torah teach? But in the second one, it's explicitly saying it's because of, it's not authoritative because it's Torah, it's authoritative because of a rabbinic legal tradition.
Great.
And that seems, there's something very subversive about that in not seeming to try to take the meaning of the supposedly authoritative text and say that what's authoritative is what we're saying, which then enables what I understand you to be saying, the rabbis to take these lines out of context and give them new meaning. And I don't know exactly what to do with all of that, but it does seem deeply odd.
So I want to start by saying not simplistic at all. You're getting at some really, really important things and questions here. There is also, yes, there is very much something going on here about rabbinic authority and who has the authority to say what the Torah means. So if a sage is just here in the Genesis Rabbah, it seems to be saying, if a sage is just making it up, having fun, playing with the Torah, that doesn't carry with it enough weight, at least in this particular area of slaughtering an animal. He needs to have actually gotten it from a teacher of how to read the story. So there's an interplay here of both the authority of the Torah itself to determine law, but also the authority of the teacher, and the teacher is the one who's going to actually do the reading of the Torah that is going to give you correct behavior. So there are many layers of authority that are chaining together and working together here.
Do you feel like you have a few minutes to briefly do that last text? Or give us your thoughts on the last text? I don't know if you...
The one, I mean, it really depends on all of you. The Sefer Rakiach, the laws of blessings, is that?
Yeah.
I'm happy to do it. I can do it pretty quickly if you're okay with it. Okay. Okay, I'll just do it quickly. I just wanted to give you, it's on page 3. I'm going to do this really quickly and then I'll free you. Okay. I I couldn't resist giving you one medieval text in this, just so you could see the afterlife of some of these texts into the medieval period. This is from Sefer HaRokeach, by Rabbi Eliezer ben Judah of Worms. You can see when he lived. This is another story, and it's another law, and it's again from the Rebecca story. I just had fun with this. So halachically, according to Jewish law, when you slaughter a wild animal or a bird, you cover their blood with earth, with dirt. But you don't do that when you slaughter what's known as a behemah, a domesticated animal. So he asked, why do we have this law of covering the blood of wild animals and birds? I found in the Agadah, so I found a story, that when Eliezer traveled with Rebekah and she fell from the camel, remember she falls from the camel when she sees Isaac for the first time? So that when Eliezer traveled with Rebekah and she fell from the camel and her signs of virginity tore. When Isaac, this is really bad rabbinic language, when Isaac came upon Rebekah and found an open opening, that's how they say it, petach patua, he went to Eliezer and said to him, what have you done? This and that I found. In other words, Isaac has sex with Rebekah for the first time, finds that she has an open opening and goes to Eliezer thinking that Eliezer had sex with Rebekah first. And Eliezer responded to him, perhaps when she fell off the camel they tore. And both of them went to that place where she fell off the camel, and they found wild animals and birds covering the blood, and the domesticated animals did not come out to cover the blood. Therefore we cover their wild animals and birds' blood, and not hers, i.e. domesticated animals. So where does the law of kashrut and how we cover blood come from? It actually comes from the story of Rebekah and Eliezer traveling back together. I know, it's crazy, right? This is wild. And Rebekah falling off the camel, and Isaac finding her not to be a virgin, and then they go, and they find wild animals and birds covering the blood. So that act of kashrut actually, again, goes back to the story of Rebekah and her marriage. Now, we can, of course, imagine all sorts of things we have no idea about Rebekah. I'll let you fill in all the blanks here that you'd like to and take your imagination with this story. But if I'm not going to just be funny about this and take it seriously for a moment, what I do want you to see from this text is actually how unflat law is for them, for these ancients and for the medievals, right? It's not just this codified thing of, oh, cover the blood. They're actually saying, oh, wait, I have to do this? There's a story. What's the story behind this law? Let me go and figure out the story. Now, we may or may not like the particular story that they find, but nevertheless, I want you to notice they're finding a story. And they're finding a story also in this particular case where the animals are actually protecting Rebekah. They're going out and covering her blood and kind of saying, we want to take care of her. We're taking care of this woman. So I just want to challenge us when we see a halakha to actually step back and say, maybe there's a story behind this. What could the story be that's behind this law, this mitzvah, that I'm doing right now? Bottom line, that's what these are teaching us and asking us to do.
I was going to mention the blood drive, but now I can promote that program. You should do it. I will say that this was the final of our 5 Shabbatot honoring our 5 core values. It also is the first, I would say, the last rather, content-rich component of our 50th anniversary celebration. We have one more upcoming program, which is on December 13th. It will not be content-rich. It's going to be, there'll be stuff that will happen. It's just going to be a party. We're going to have some fun. That Saturday night, we're going to come together. We're going to dress like it's 1974, when the shul was founded, and we're going to have a great time. So I want to encourage people to come on the 13th as we round out our wonderful, really wonderful 50th anniversary year. On that note, I want to acknowledge just one more time the really important work of David Finkler and Judy Gottlieb, who have been our 50th anniversary. We had a full committee of people doing a lot of actual work in a lot of different areas. Our staff worked incredibly hard throughout this year as well. This morning, Rabbi Kanarek got to lane from our brand new Sefer Torah, as did others. So many things that we can hold on to. And so I think where I'll leave you is that when we finish a tractate of Talmud, there's a tradition of doing a special it's almost like an incantation. I can't even describe it as a prayer. It's like this weird incantation that talks about Rav Papa, and we say Hadran alayich, right? We'll return to you again and again. Rav Tyler talked earlier about one of the things he learned from Dr. Kanarek as her student is the importance of coming back and reading a text again and again. The rabbis call this chazara, return. And we do it every year with the Torah as we read it again and again. We saw the pedagogic approach of Jane in this wonderful teaching where we came to these texts that seemed pretty abstruse and then read them again and again, and all of a sudden they began to reveal themselves to us. I just want to say the learning has been really tremendous. I hope that we will, Hadran alayich, we'll be able to return to you as our teacher, but also to these really intriguing texts that you've brought us, but that more importantly, Beth Am congregation will continue in the next 50 years and many beyond as a learning congregation engaged in the ancient wisdom, and also a willingness to be flexible and exploratory with our texts, so that when we find that there are things that we do, we might go looking for why we do them. Or when we find that there's something we do that doesn't make a lot of sense, we might go looking for explanations of perhaps how we might evolve them and how we might evolve as Jews. So Shavua Tov, everybody. Once again, Yasher Koach to Dr. Kanarek. Get home safe, and don't forget to give blood. Thank you. Martin's in the patriarch. Sunday morning, 20 minutes, 25 minutes. So I asked her if she'd take the bag. I think it's an 8 o'clock flight. I want to get rid of it. Yeah. Or she has a I got it.
Reminds me of the last line. Were you? Domesticated animal. I just remember when Kelly, I think one of her prep lectures was Not So Nice Tales of Torah. Where she talked about like the sex of blood starters, I think, and like Noah getting strong. When Kelly first came and she gave her lecture for like her audition lecture.
A great lecture, not so uncomfortable part.
Yes, exactly. So at work a lot of times, I will purposely put staples in the wrong places when you're putting them in the binder. It's really bad area and they don't fit. So I'll like be in binder and I always go from store to store, sometimes different stores. I'm like, okay, this one time it's going to be a different spot. It's going to make it more space in the binder. But maybe but it could be.
Yeah, I disagree.
Good to see you.
Right, yes, it's a little more complicated. What happens is once what happens in Jewish law is that when a girl is a minor, the father can betroth her against when she gets to